Today I'll be reading from Luke 13, verses 10 through 17. Now he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath, and just then there appeared a woman with a spirit that had crippled her for 18 years. She was bent over and was quite unable to stand up straight. When Jesus saw her, he called her over and said, "Woman, you are set free from your ailment." When he laid his hands on her, immediately she stood up straight and began praising God. But the leader of the synagogue, indignant because Jesus had cured her on the Sabbath, kept saying to the crowd, "There are 6 days on which work ought to be done. Come on those days and be cured, and not on the Sabbath day." But the Lord answered him and said, "You hypocrites, does not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from the manger and lead it to water? And ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan bound for 18 long years, be set free from this bondage on the Sabbath day?" When he said this, all his opponents were put to shame, and the entire crowd was rejoicing at all the wonderful things being done by him.
Yeah, I'm a little short. Will you pray with me? Holy and loving God, may the words of our mouths and the meditations of our hearts be pleasing to you, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. There are various iterations of this confessional writing that I have seen quite a bit in the past couple years that goes something like this. First, they came for, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't blank. And it always ends with this same line. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. You've seen these, right? Different iterations of that. Insert different people groups or names in that blank space. They've always struck me as incredibly profound, reminding me that just because an injustice doesn't touch my life or the life of those closest to me doesn't mean it's not worthy of attention. A reminder that all of us belong to one another, even when our experiences are different. I've never known where this originated, but it turns out that these are words of confession first spoken by the late German Lutheran pastor, Reverend Martin Nichole. Okay. About his indifference and inaction towards, and therefore complicity with, the violence and destruction of the Nazi regime during World War II. That resulted in the imprisonment, persecution, and murder of millions of people. Because while he is remembered for his opposition and resistance eventually, his journey did not begin that way. Born in 1892 and the son of a Lutheran pastor, Nichole served in the Imperial German Navy during World War I. And while he received high honors for his service, he was devastated by Germany's defeat, resulting in the collapse of the German Empire, which he knew and loved. He was also in opposition to the German government that was put in place after the war. So he left the military and put his efforts into becoming an ordained pastor, while also participating in right-wing and anti-Semitic political parties and organizations. Things change all the time, don't they? This led him to be an avid supporter of the rising Nazi regime, and he voted for the Nazi Party in 1933, believing that this strong leadership was the answer to the ills that faced his country. However, he quickly saw things crumble, particularly in the church, as the movement's leader threw his support into the radical religious movement called the Deutsche Christen. I'm not German. Actually, I am German. I just don't know German. Anyway. Yeah. We'll figure it out together, right? Which is translated into German Christians. So this was a movement that a gentleman, that I'm just not going to mention his name, was very much in support of. And it sought to remove all Jewish elements from Christianity, including denying that Jesus was Jewish, rejecting the authority of the Old Testament, and removing parts of the New Testament that didn't match up with their ideals. And eventually prohibited any and all clergy with any Jewish descent from serving, etc., etc. As Nichole witnessed the increasing overreach and desire to control the Protestant church, he began speaking out publicly in opposition to the German Christians movement and the Nazi church policy, which eventually resulted in his arrest and imprisonment, and not just one concentration camp, but 2, for 8 years. And he was only released in 1945 after the Allies defeated Nazi Germany and liberated him and other concentration camp prisoners. After the war, he began publicly speaking out, publicly confessing. I think this is so powerful. Publicly confessing his early complicity with Nazi ideals and his eventual change of heart. Speaking the words that are permanently displayed at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum for all to read. First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. It's a really sobering story, isn't it? Fueled by his anger and frustration with Germany's defeat in World War I, he enthusiastically threw his support behind a government that was willing to dehumanize and persecute a group of people he ended up suffering alongside. Nichole felt the weight of these choices in his blindness until it was too late. And he spent the rest of his life in pacifism and anti-war activism until he died in 1984. But imagine that. That's 40-some years? I can't do math. It's a long time to sit with that. He carried a really heavy load. It's just not time. It's a story as old as time, isn't it? For Nichole, the persecution began not towards his people, but the other. And he didn't step out until his own people were attacked. In the 1960s, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. reminded those, especially his fellow white clergymen, while imprisoned for his participation in nonviolent actions against segregation, that told him and others in the civil rights movement to just wait. That justice too long delayed is justice denied. And Jesus, several times throughout the gospel, was told that he was out of line because he too was acting out of order on holy time. In today's gospel text, only 8 verses long, we get a quick snapshot of Jesus being criticized by those in religious power for doing things the wrong way, at the wrong time, while he was being witnessed in the work of bringing freedom and liberation to the most vulnerable and marginalized. And in this particular healing story, Jesus went to the synagogue as a faithful Jew for communal worship, for prayer, and to teach. And he saw this woman on the way out. By the way, women would not have been inside with all of the men listening to this teacher. They would have been on the outside. So when he was walking out, he saw her, a woman who had been crippled and literally bent over for 18 years. It seemed she and those around her were resigned to her fate. She would be crippled for her whole life. It's just the way that it was going to be. This was a woman who had always had her eyes to the ground. Without intentional effort, she wouldn't have even seen Jesus. Well, at least any more of him than maybe his feet. Without intentional effort, she couldn't look up. Without intentional effort, she couldn't look into the eyes of those that she loved. Life was limited, and her limitedness made her vulnerable and even weak. There was always this thing that was holding her back. And with the words of Jesus' mouth and the touch of his hand, she stood up straight for the first time in almost 2 decades. She immediately praised God, as did those around her. But instead of celebrating this woman's life-changing moment, the religious leader in the synagogue rebuked Jesus and his willingness to break Sabbath rules. And he did this indirectly too, like really catty. Some people, not going to name any names, but some people think it's okay to break the rules. But I tell you, rules are rules. Healing is a good thing, of course, but let's not do things out of order. This act is absolutely inappropriate on the Sabbath, for it is to be a day of rest, not work. The man wanted to put Jesus in his place, right? And even does so without even looking at him or addressing him. He kind of tells him off in everybody's hearing, but not looking at him. Healing stories fill us with holy wonder, but they can also be really difficult. Jesus didn't heal everyone, or we don't see Jesus healing everyone. We don't know why Jesus picked her and not others. There were probably other people with sickness, with physical disabilities, and people struggling with the throes of mental illness who were present that day. But in that synagogue on that day, an unsuspecting woman who came to worship and to pray had her life changed forever. Because Jesus decided to exercise his healing and life-giving touch, Jesus granted this woman freedom she hadn't experienced in 18 years. Life was different, and her immediate response is praise. How could you do anything else, really, when you receive that kind of liberation, when you receive that kind of healing? This interaction gave her a whole new depth of faith. God had done something great for her that she would never forget. Jesus saw an opportunity for liberation, and he centered it rather than trying to decide if it was the right time. Even if it broke cultural norms of all kinds, working on the Sabbath, a rabbi speaking with a woman, and particularly one with a physical deformity, something that made her invisible to those around her. It made the religious leaders mad. But it seemed that everyone else was able to see the gift for what it was: grace and a reason to celebrate. What happens when religious people try to limit God's grace? When the church says, not yet, or not that way, who suffers? Who pays? Commentator Ronald P. Byers wrote, "It is easy to counsel someone else to be patient. Rules are more likely to be considered reasonable when they do not affect the rule enforcer." Jesus apparently identifies with the woman rather than the leader, as though her disfigurement were his own or perhaps his mother's. It's different when you see the face of someone you love. When Jesus began his ministry, he didn't spend his time in the synagogue. He ministered in the community, and he centered vulnerable and marginalized people. He touched the wrong people: lepers, demon-possessed, women like the one in our story. He ate with the wrong people, and he stood with the wrong people. And while his life touched so many in such beautiful ways, the folks who stood against him were the people we would hope would be his biggest fans. Ministers of God Most High. People called to shepherd God's people, but they fell into the trap of seeing their job as being faithful to the law, to the system, and it stopped them from actually seeing the people in front of them. But Jesus saw differently. He always did. Jesus saw people as if they were his beloveds, his inner circle, his family. He saw those others passed by and he fixed his gaze on them. He prioritized them rather than brushing them aside, and he even unhesitantly broke the law to love them. Because he wasn't bound by his faith. He was freed by his faith. And that enabled him to love extravagantly and at every single opportunity. As usual, Jesus' words and teachings are good news and bad news, depending on where you find your feet. For those who cause suffering or who stand in the way of healing and liberation, Jesus confronts. His message to us in this moment demands that we really open our eyes to see as he sees. For those who have felt invisible, who struggle with physical ailments, mental health, who have had their humanity threatened and their dignity relinquished by those in power who cannot or will not see us, Jesus sees us and longs for our wholeness and calls us back into community. That's one of the miracles in this story. Jesus not only restored her body, but he restored her back into the community. She's no longer invisible, but seen as someone worthy of Jesus' gaze and touch. That isn't always a lesson that we teach in words, but in action. The work of the church is not to be perfect. It's to be faithful. And when we actually believe that, there is freedom to follow Jesus, who was less concerned about the what and more about the who. Less about what is right or orderly, but what is good, what is liberative. When our aim is to be faithful, there is space to recognize and confess when we have missed the mark. When we have been ignorant to the suffering of our neighbors, when we have been complicit in others' suffering, when we have gotten it all wrong, when we have hidden ourselves from each other. Because no one has the eyes of Jesus, eyes that see everyone, that is able to pierce beyond self-protection and bias. The life of faith is one of ongoing transformation, and that requires that we be willing to see our blind spots when they are revealed to us, and to repent of the ways that do not lead to life. God doesn't leave us to do this work alone, but equips, empowers, and inspires us to live in this kind of way. And we are brought into community to do it together. So I'm going to throw it back to you. What does this stir up in you? How does this story touch your heart?